Very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Dudley College of Technology. I'm the Chief Executive and Principal. My name is Neil Thomas, and we're very proud to host this event here today. Before I bring Kieran on to introduce the event, just a little bit of housekeeping, as always. We're not expecting any fire drills. I very much hope we don't have a fire drill, but if we do, just follow our colleagues out the back door and they'll escort you out. And if you've got any support needs at all during today's presentation, if you need any help, you need to know where things are, again, just catch any of our team. They're dotted all the way around the sides and back of the building, and they'll be very happy to help. Thank you ever so much for joining us, and to introduce the proceedings, I'm going to ask Councillor Kieran Case to come on to me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Dudley's annual Holocaust Commemoration. I want to start by saying a big thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. I also want to thank everyone at Dudley College and the Students' Union. A particular thank you to Amanda and all the team, all the volunteers and the Holocaust Educational Trust for their help in ensuring that this event has once again gone ahead today. It's an honour as Chair of the Organising Committee to be involved in this. Today we're joined by the Mayor of Dudley, Councillor Sue Greenaway, Councillor Patrick Harley, the Leader of the Council, local members of Parliament and representatives from across the region. It's brilliant that we're also joined by teachers and so many pupils from local schools, as well as students from the college. It's particularly important, I think, that we ensure young people know and learn where hatred and prejudice can lead. This afternoon we'll be hearing from Molly Hare, the President of Dudley College Students' Union, Cassidy Woodrow, who has visited Auschwitz with the Holocaust Educational Trust, the Bishop of Dudley, Martin Gorrick, and Rabbi Margaret Jacobi. So a big thank you to you all for being part of this event. But most of all, I want to thank our keynote speaker, Eva Clark, for taking the time to join us today and share her personal experience of the Holocaust. It's truly humbling and inspirational to us all, Eva, that you're prepared to use your experience of these terrible events and give so much of your time to teach communities like ours about history's greatest crime. So we're all very grateful to you for joining us today. The Holocaust was a systematic genocide of the Jewish people, and we're here today to honour the memory of 6 million Jewish men, women and children, as well as, of course, remembering all others killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. We learn from listening to survivors like Eva that whilst the Holocaust ended in the industrial murder of millions of people in gas chambers, it actually started with prejudice and hatred, with communities being divided and people being singled out because of their race or religion. So we're here today to remember the past, help build a stronger, more united community, and rededicate ourselves to opposing the ugly poison of racial or religious prejudice and hatred wherever we find it. So I'd now like to invite Molly, the President of the Students' Union, who's going to read a poem for us. Thank you very much.
Ordinary people, the perpetrators, the persecuted, rescuers and bystanders, deniers, witnesses, victims and survivors. The cruelties of history can happen again, affecting ordinary people living ordinary lives. Extraordinary choices for us all to decide. Stand up, challenge hatred, be respectful and guide. I'd now like to welcome on stage Dudley College student and Holocaust Educational Trust Ambassador Cassidy Woodrow.
The current conflict in Ukraine confirms Hegel's truism that the one thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. However, history is often shaped by the collective rather than the individual. Together, we have the power for common good as a collective voice. During the recent, sudden and swift decline of peace in Europe, starting in February last year, I had the honour of being selected to represent the college in the Lessons from Auschwitz programme, learning about and reflecting upon the worst aspects of human behaviour. I participated in online seminars where we examined beautiful yet emotive photographs of Jewish families from before the Holocaust. As a photography student, this was particularly fascinating. Experience Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau through virtual reality opened my eyes and helped me gain a more accurate outlook of what Jewish people went through. Though no matter how much I tried to imagine what it was like living in those conditions, I know that I would never fully understand what 6 million Jewish men, women and children went through. I had the incredible opportunity of hearing from Holocaust survivor Stephen Frank BEM. Nothing could have prepared me for the stories he told. He spoke eloquently about how his religious faith was tested by his experiences. He said, "At times I felt that God was not on my side. Knowing that he felt like he wasn't being fully protected by the one who was there to protect him broke my heart." The Nazis went to great lengths to try to eliminate any knowledge of the Holocaust. Files were destroyed, gas chambers were blown up, and evidence was removed. No one was ever meant to know about Auschwitz-Birkenau. If the Nazis were successful with erasing all knowledge of Birkenau, we would have never known about the 1.1 million murdered at the site. Over 90% of that number were Jews. Looking to the future, as a young person, I feel a responsibility to share my findings and experiences with my peers and to guard against racism, discrimination and intolerance. My own lens-based work explores and celebrates diversity in all its forms. Mine and my peers' photography work will be exhibited in this very room on the 29th of March, promoting diversity and individualism. I myself am visually impaired. According to Humankind, A Hopeful History, Rutger Bregman presents a radical idea that human beings are very largely innately good, and provides evidence for this by assessing many instances of incredibly positive and supportive human behaviour in extreme circumstances throughout history. This is an idea less documented in history books and ignored by the news and mass media, but gives us hope. However, let us not be complacent. We all need to play our part in encouraging kindness, tolerance and understanding in order to prevent recurrences of discrimination, hatred and abuse. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is Ordinary People. It's important to understand that ordinary people took part in all aspects of the Holocaust. This includes the perpetrators, the bystanders and the witnesses involved. But most importantly, ordinary people were victims. It's crucial that we as ordinary people play our part to ensure horrific events like the Holocaust aren't repeated. The Holocaust is gradually receding into history, but actually it is more relevant than ever, and personal testimonies, like the one we will hear shortly from Eva, become more important than ever too. Time is running out, and memory will soon be history. One cannot imagine the fear and horror of the Holocaust years. It is a world we hope will not be witnessed again, but which we nevertheless still need to fully understand, to prevent it ever happening again. To help us imagine, remember and understand, it is my great honour to introduce to you Eva Clark.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me back to Dudley College. It's a great honour for me to have been invited here again. The last time I was here was in January of 2013, a few months before my mother, Anke Bergman, died, aged 96. I well remember how gratified she was that her experiences were still being remembered and related so many years after the events themselves. I'm here today because, yes, I am a survivor of the Holocaust, but only just, because I was born in a concentration camp right at the very end of the Second World War. But that comes right at the very end of my story. Oh, I didn't know that was up. Please move on to the next picture. That's taken a long time ago. Can somebody tell me who I should be asking to move the photographs on? Yes. Tim. Excellent. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Fine. Okay. So, sorry, I haven't asked that before. Right. Yes, I was born in a concentration camp. And I start all my presentations with this map, which is one of Sir Martin Gilbert's maps. He was a very well-known historian of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, and of Winston Churchill. And this map shows all the main concentration camps and death camps that existed in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War. It doesn't show all the camps by any means, because there were hundreds and hundreds. What it does show are the main ones, and it does show all the death camps, the red ones. Everywhere where you see the swastika, the Nazi emblem, there you see a name, and that name indicates either a transit camp, a slave labour camp, a concentration camp, or a death camp. And the three camps that my family were involved in are the three names you can see in boxes. The first one is called Theresienstadt. That is the German word for a town in the country that used to be called Czechoslovakia and is now called the Czech Republic. It means the town of Teresa. It was named after a former empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maria Theresa. When I talk about it, I tend to use its Czech name, which is Terezy, simply because my mother was Czech, and I find it less of a mouthful than saying Theresienstadt. The second place you will have all heard of, that is the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But the third one, Mauthausen, I doubt whether you've heard of, and that is in Austria. Now, there's a second reason why I use this particular map, and that is to bring to your attention the inset and the circle in the top left-hand corner, where you can see a map of part of the British Isles. And there you can also see a swastika. The swastika is over the Channel Islands, over Jersey and Guernsey and Orkney, because they were invaded by the Germans. There were Jewish people living there. And they were either imprisoned on the islands or they were sent to concentration camps in Europe. So that shows you how closely the whole thing came to mainland Britain. Next picture, please, Tim. Now, because I'm telling you a family story, it comes naturally to me to show you family photographs. And this is a photograph of my German family. My father was German but Jewish. It has an interesting place and date. It is Berlin in 1913, so just 1 year before the start of the First World War. Next picture, please. This is the same photograph, but the adults you can see highlighted in the background, they are my grandparents with their 3 children in the foreground, and my father is the little boy on the right-hand side. Now, in 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, all those 3 children by then were grown up. They were all grown up and they all realized that it would be advisable if they could get out of Germany. Next picture, please. And the first one to leave was my Uncle Rolf. He left Germany, and first he went to live in Holland, where he met and married a Dutch lady who was also Jewish. And when the Germans invaded Holland, they managed to escape to Switzerland, Switzerland being a neutral country during the Second World War. And there my uncle joined this particular army, and I wonder if any of you might recognize what the uniform is. It's actually the American Army uniform. And after the war, my uncle was very proud of his photograph. He would say to us, look at me in GI uniform in front of, in quotes, my GI. So they would say. Next picture, please. My father's sister, Mariga, she and her husband and their son, they left Germany quite late in December of 1938. But nevertheless, they still managed to get on the ship that was headed for Sydney in Australia. So they were safe. My cousin was about 5 years of age at the time, but I don't happen to have a photograph of him at that age. Here, I think he was graduating from medical studies at Sydney University. Next picture, please. As I mentioned already, my father was German. And I like to think of this as being my star photograph. I hope you might agree with me by the time you've seen them all. This is a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. They were married on the 15th of May, 1940. Which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. My father, he left Germany, as I said, in 1933, and he managed to get to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. He thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't have come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother, and I would not be standing here today. My father had been an architect and interior designer, and when he first came to Prague, he managed to get a job working for a furniture manufacturer and helping to build the film sets. The studios are still there, the Randolph studios. My mother had been a law student at the Charles University, but when the Germans invaded, they closed all the universities, and she was no longer able to study. Now, I'm sure you know that when the Germans first invaded any country, they immediately imposed various rules and regulations upon Jewish people. And there are hundreds and hundreds of those rules and regulations, and they all come under the general heading of the Nuremberg laws. I will tell you just a few to give you an idea. First and foremost, Jewish people immediately lost their citizenship. They were no longer allowed to vote. Jewish people were immediately thrown out of the professions. They could no longer be doctors, lawyers, teachers. Jewish children were immediately expelled from mainstream schools. They had to go to special schools. Jewish people were forbidden from marrying people from other faiths. There was a curfew. Jews were not allowed to go out in the evening. They were only allowed to go to the shops at certain times of the day, invariably the late afternoon, when there would have been as little fresh produce available as possible. Jewish people were no longer allowed to keep animals. They had to hand them over. They were no longer allowed to keep their cars or their bicycles. They were also forbidden to go to parks, swimming pools, theatres, concerts, cinemas. All those things were forbidden. Their lives were meant to be more and more restricted within their own communities. But because these restrictions happened gradually, one by one, and because none of them, had a life sentence, certainly not initially, people tended to think, well, if this is the worst it's going to get, we can cope with this, we can live with this. But by the same token, sometimes some people would test these restrictions. It's a very common human reaction. I'm sure you've all experienced it, I know I have. If you are told, you're forbidden to do something, well, your gut reaction is to go and do it. Whether you actually do is another matter. And one day, my mother decided she was going to go to the cinema despite the fact that it was forbidden. She was sitting in the cinema watching the film. The secret police came in. They stopped the film, and they started to go through the audience, row by row, looking at their ID papers. And my mother was terrified because she had no idea how they would react when they got to her and when they saw the large J for Jew on her papers. And they got to about halfway through the auditorium and they stopped, but they left the cinema. And they had stopped just one row in front of where my mother had been sitting. And boy, did she breathe a sigh of me. And ever since she told me about this, I was always trying to get her to remember what on earth the film was that made her take such a risk. But it was such a frightening experience, and it was the first. Far worse was to come, but she didn't know that. It was such a frightening experience that she obviously blanked out that memory, but what I can tell you is that when we first came to this country, and when I was safely in school trying to learn English as quickly as possible, I think my mother used to go to the cinema almost every single day. And that was fantastic light relief for her after her wartime experiences. It was a real need, it was almost like an obsession to catch up with the frivolous things of life. I do have to tell you that when she came home and told my father where she'd been, he was furious at the risks she'd taken. But anyway. Right, now, where am I? Tim, please, next photograph. Can I say it's very useful you have the name Tim, because that's the name of my eldest son, so no chance of forgetting it. Now, this is a photograph of my mother's older sister, Stena, with her friend, Herbert. And the reason I showed this photograph is to show you that they are wearing the yellow stars, which was one of the later restrictions imposed upon Jewish people. Everybody in the family had to wear the yellow star every time they went outside their own front door. You had to buy as many yellow stars as there were members of the family, age 6 and above. And my mother distinctly remembered what she was wearing the first time she ever had to wear one of these. She was wearing a dark green skirt, a tan suede jacket, hat, gloves, and she was going to the shops. She said it actually didn't look that bad on the suede jacket, but nevertheless she was very, very apprehensive as to how people might react to her when she went outside wearing it. But every time my mother went outside wearing the yellow star, nothing ever happened to her. People just ignored it, and that was the best possible news. Nobody pointed at her, nobody laughed at her, nobody was rude to her, nobody spat at her. All those things happened to other people, but it never happened to my mother. We speculated as to why not, and all she could think was, she was a young woman, she was full of self-confidence, and she was not going to be canned. She wasn't going to be bullied by anybody. And I think the fact that she wasn't a bad looker must have helped. Now, there's a second reason why I do actually have a yellow star to show you, but I'll just hold it up, but I'm not sure whether you will actually be able to see it right at the back. This is a genuine yellow star. And another survivor whose name has also just been mentioned, Stephen Frank, he actually gave this to me from his collection, his mother's collection. The second reason why I use this particular photograph is simply to show you that they are smiling. They are smiling because they were out for a walk, they were engaged to be married, they were happy, and they were out for a walk before curfew. And I assume at the instant that the photograph was taken, they had forgotten that they were wearing the yellow star, with any implication that it might have for them in the future. And very fortunately for them, they had absolutely no idea what was to come. And I will tell you about them later. Next picture, please. My mother had another sister, and her name was Rouge. Rouge means rose. And this is my Aunt Rose and my cousin Peter when he was about 5. And the next picture, please, shows Peter a bit older with a photograph of his father, my Uncle Tom. And once again, I wonder if any of you might know what the uniform is. Any volunteers to say what it is? No? Yeah? It's not the RAF, but you're close. It's the British Army. And the reason my uncle is wearing the British Army uniform is the fact that he managed to escape from occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939. He got to the UK, he joined the British Army. He also managed to get a visa for his wife and for his child, but tragically my aunt refused to come. And the reason she refused to come was because basically it was a very unhappy marriage, and she said to her husband, she said, no, we'll be fine. We'll stay with my parents, with her parents, my grandparents. And that was the attitude of an awful lot, I would say, the majority of Jewish people in occupied countries. Because initially nobody had any idea at all that they might be sent away anywhere, let alone to something called a slave labour camp, concentration camp, or a death camp. They had no idea. They just thought if they kept a low profile, more or less stuck to those rules and regulations, they'd be okay. That is human nature. You'd hope for the best. And again, I'll tell you what happened to them later on. Next picture, please. This is an aerial photograph of this place called Terezín or Tereziustadt. It is about 40 miles outside of Prague, and before the war it was a garrison town where Czech soldiers were stationed. But when the Germans invaded, the Czech army was disbanded, and the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And Jewish people from all over Europe were sent there in their thousands. And when I was growing up and I was asking my mother, how she was taken prisoner, because I had various images in my mind. I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, I'd seen films, I'd seen documentaries. And I had this picture in my mind that perhaps, middle of one night, 3 o'clock in the morning, there would have been soldiers banging on the doors, soldiers with guns and dogs dragging people out of their beds. And I said to her, is that what happened to you? And she said, no, nothing like that. She said, we received a card in the post. And the card said that on a certain day at a certain time we would have to report to a warehouse in Prague near one of the mainland railway stations. And that's what happened. At the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, my father received his card and he left. You were told you could take a small suitcase, you were advised to take warm clothing. You were also advised to take a few pots and pans, which indicated to them that they were going somewhere where they'd be able to cook, they'd be able to look after themselves. And they assumed that they were being sent to some sort of labour camp. And a few days later, my mother received her card and she left. And not only was she carrying her handbag and her suitcase, she was also carrying a large cardboard box. And I said to her, what on earth did you have in the box? Do you have enough to worry about, enough to carry? And she said, well, I think I had between 2 or 3 dozen donuts in the box. And I said, why donuts? And she said, well, your father liked donuts. And it was a very sensible thing to do, as she had no idea where the next meal was coming from. So she was bringing food, it just happened to be donuts. And I said to her, did they get him? She said, yes, they weren't terribly fresh anymore, but they're perfectly edible, and he was pleased. Now, my mother had to spend 3 days and 3 nights in that warehouse with hundreds and hundreds of people. They weren't given much food or water, they had to sleep on the floor, and at the end of those 3 days they were marched to the railway station. And the route was lined with young German officers, 18, 20-year-olds. And there was one young German officer who knew he had a bit of power, and he wielded it. He didn't harm my mother physically, he was just a bit sarcastic with words. I don't know if any of you are studying German, the students, or if any of you here speak German. I will say what he said in German, and I will translate it, and I apologize for the swear word, but that's what he said. After 3 days, the moisture from the donuts was making the cardboard soften. So the whole box was coming adrift, it was coming apart. And this soldier could see that my mother was having great difficulty with it, and he said to her, "Es ist scheißegal, ob die Schachtel mitkommt," which means I couldn't give a ... if that box goes with you or not, implying that it wasn't going to do her much good as she was going. Now, he couldn't have had any idea whatsoever what was going to happen to her. All he knew was that it wasn't going to be anything good, and he just wanted to twist the knife metaphorically. She ignored him, she got on the train, she arrived in Terezin. Next picture, please. I'm now showing you 2 drawings of Terezin because I think they are more evocative of the sort of place that it was at the time. These drawings were done secretly by professional artists who themselves were prisoners. And the drawings were discovered quite by chance after the end of the war. They were discovered buried under the floorboards or in cracks in the walls. And I use this particular one to try to give you the impression of a very crowded place. Because before the war, when it was a Czech garrison town, there would have been, a couple of thousand soldiers stationed there. But during the war, when it was a ghetto and a concentration camp, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people crammed into very, very crowded conditions. Next picture, please. And on the inside, it looked like this. People basically lived on bunks. They were trying to make a niche, a den for themselves, with a few personal belongings that they had been able to bring. And when families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one part, women to another part, elderly people to another part, children to yet another part. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent they led separate lives. When my mother arrived in Terezin, she was fortunate enough to be given a job. Jobs weren't paid or anything, but life was a bit easier if you had a job. And her job was working with a man who had the responsibility for sharing out the food. There wasn't much food there, but what there was, they tried to share out in a fair fashion. And that meant that she had access to food. When I say she had access to food, she would steal. She would steal a potato, a carrot, an onion, just something with which to make a more substantial soup. And that was literally of vital importance, because at one time my mother had the responsibility every single day for trying to find food for 15 members of her close family. Every single day, that was her main worry. How on earth was she going to find enough food for all those people? And that was quite apart from the greater worry as to what on earth was going to happen to them all in the future. Next picture, please. And amongst the people she was trying to find food for were her parents, my grandparents, Ida and Stanislav. Next picture, please. The next picture will show you my father as a young man with his mother, Selma. And the next picture, please, shows you his father, my grandfather, Louis. Now, my grandfather, Louis, was the only one of my 4 grandparents to have survived the war. And we believe there is a specific reason for that, although we don't actually have any proof. I told you at the beginning that my father was German. His father was German. In the First World War, my grandfather was in the German army. In the First World War, my grandfather was given the Iron Cross First Class. That is the highest military honour that the Germans bestow upon their soldiers. What happens to him in the Second World War? He's thrown into a concentration camp, and most of his family is killed. My grandfather was not sent east. To be sent east was a euphemism, another way of saying you're going to be sent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. He remained in Terezin throughout the war, and at the end of the war he was found to be alive, just about. And via the Red Cross, contact was made between him and my uncle and aunt, who by that stage had returned from Switzerland to Holland. One day there was a knock on the door, and there was my grandfather in the Rijksdienst stood up in, and he lived with them for the rest of his life. And when I was a little girl, we used to go and visit them quite often, but it was very sad, because I would come into the room and my grandfather couldn't see me, because he had been blinded by the gas in the First World War. And he couldn't speak to me, because he spoke German and Dutch, and I only spoke Czech and English. But nevertheless, I'd come into the room, I'd give him a kiss, I'd say, "Hello, grandfather," and he knew that I was the only surviving child in the family. Next picture, please. Now, I imagine this photograph is familiar to most of you, if not all of you. It shows you the gateway to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But before I start that part of my mother's story, I have to tell you about two of the things that happened to my parents in Dudley. To a large extent, Dudley was a transit camp, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent onwards to their deaths in Auschwitz and other places. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers with children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. They would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. But because my parents were young, strong and well able to work, so they remained in Dudley for 3 years. That was a remarkably long, a very unusually long period of time. You know, just think back 3 years in your lives. It's a long time. And my mother said, luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because it was on that day that my father was sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. And the reason she volunteered to follow him was because she had no idea where he'd been sent. And being the eternal optimist, she thought, well, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know. But she thought nothing could get any worse, they would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw my father again. And she heard from an eyewitness, a friend, quite soon after the end of the war, that my father had actually been shot dead on a death march on the 18th of January 1945. And Auschwitz, it was near Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian army on the 27th of January 1945, which is why we, as I'm sure you're all aware, why we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January, which is next Friday. Now, the other thing that I have to tell you about what happened to my parents in Dudley, you will appreciate, is pretty important, because it concerns my brother and his conception, me and my conception. I told you that when families first arrived in Dudley, the sexes were segregated. Well, in 1943, my mother discovered that she was pregnant. And when I was, 12, 13, no doubt when it was at its most embarrassing, well, I imagine you agree with me, it's embarrassing at any age, I said to her, so how come you got pregnant? You were my father. And she replied in a very clever way. She said, well, she said, it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences, end of story. But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences. Because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death. Because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish people. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregation was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word killed, they used the word euthanasia, and my mother never heard of the word euthanasia before. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to those families. We assume they all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jiří means George, he was born in February of 1944, he was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, which is a very strange thing to say, but true. Because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent, they would have both been sent straight to the gas chambers. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show because it was very, very early on. So again, she lived to see another day. Now, you've probably seen images of how people were transported to the death camps. They were sent on trains, not ordinary trains, but cattle trucks, that were so crowded that people couldn't even sit down. They were given no food, no water, and sometimes these journeys took several days. There were no toilet facilities. There might have been a bucket, which would have been totally inadequate very quickly. So by the time the trains actually arrived in Auschwitz, invariably the people inside them would have been in a very poor mental and physical condition, especially the elderly and the children, because they had the least resistance, the least stamina. Auschwitz itself consisted of several different camps. Auschwitz I was brick-built, and that is where all the Polish prisoners were sent. And that is where today it is not only a place of memorial, but also a museum where you have the collections of luggage, the collections of shoes, the collections of hair, the collection of spectacles, all those things in Auschwitz I. But this Auschwitz-Birkenau, this is a place purely of memorial. This is where all the Jews were sent and where all the Roma and Sinti were sent. And this photograph was taken at the end of the war. Next picture, please. The next photograph shows you what it looks like today behind that gateway. This is a vast area right back to the tree line that would have been filled with wooden huts, such as you can see in the foreground. But because Auschwitz-Birkenau was not preserved in any way until many years later, most of those wooden huts disintegrated, or the wood was stolen as firewood after the war. But what you can see in the distance makes for a very poignant memorial to all those thousands and thousands and thousands of people who died, who were killed there. Because those uprights you can see, they are brick chimneys. They are nothing whatsoever to do with the crematorium, but they are brick chimneys, because inside each hut you would have had 2 of those chimneys, and they would have been joined together by a brick tunnel. And there was a grate at either end. And the idea was that you'd have fuel that you burn in the grate, and heat generated would pass along the tunnel, thereby giving warmth to the hut. But of course, their lives were meant to be at all comfortable, so they certainly didn't have any fuel. And as I say, it is a very private memorial. And on the inside of the huts, next picture please, it looked like this. These huts were incredibly crowded. Some of them before the war might have been stables that would have housed, say, 60 or 70 horses. But at the time that I'm talking about, they housed hundreds and hundreds of people, 500, 800, even up to 1,000 people. And when people arrived in Auschwitz, that's when they went through a selection for the first time. And selection always meant life or death. And my mother managed to get through a selection because she was still considered to be strong enough for work. And this was, despite the fact that she was somewhat malnourished after 3 years in Terezin. To give you an idea of my mother's physical strength, when she was 14 years of age, she was school's junior backstroke swimming champion of Czechoslovakia. So that gives you an idea of her physical strength. And she always maintained that if this whole experience had to happen to her, she was at the right age, not only physically, but psychologically, emotionally. She was in her mid-20s, she was tough, she was strong. And the people who got through a selection, various procedures happened to them. First of all, they were told if they managed to bring any luggage, to put their suitcases on the ground, to write their names on them, that they would be reunited with them later. Well, of course they weren't. They then were sent into real showers. Well, at this stage, they had absolutely no idea at all that anything other than a real shower existed, a gas chamber. They then had all their hair shaved. They then were given that sort of striped uniform and a pair of shoes, if they were lucky. And then they were tattooed with a number on their arms. And after that, they were sent into these huts. And when my mother and her friends arrived in a hut like this, they were so frightened and so bewildered. They just couldn't work out what this place was. And they said to the women there, what happens here? What goes on here? When will we see our families again? And the women actually laughed at them because they couldn't understand that anybody arriving in Auschwitz would have no idea what went on there. And they said, well, we'll all go up and smoke and you'll never see your families again. And in that instant, they realized what went on there. People were given hardly any sustenance on a daily basis. They were given a sort of black oily liquid in the morning, which is called coffee. And they were given another liquid in the evening, which is called soup. And if they're very lucky, perhaps they might have been able to dredge up the odd potato peeling from the bottom of the bucket. And they're given one piece of bread. That is all they were given. So an awful lot of people just died of starvation, and you would often wake up in the mornings to find corpses on either side of you. Now, apart from the selections, the other thing that happened at least twice daily was called the appel. Appel means registration. Sounds like a very mild sort of word, doesn't it? What it actually meant was that every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, everybody would have to stand outside their hut to be counted. And if the numbers didn't tally, they would just have to stand there till they did, or until there was some sort of explanation. And my mother said it was very, very hard to stand stock still for hours and hours on end, regardless of the weather. And you tried to keep as low a profile as you could because you had no idea how the Nazis might react to you if for some reason you drew attention to yourself. And my mother actually fainted several times during these uphells, and that could have been very bad news for her. But she was always so relieved to find that when she came round, to find that she was actually being held up by her friends on either side, which meant that she hadn't sunk to the ground, she hadn't drawn attention to herself, and again, she lived to see another day. Next picture, please. Shows you a selection. In the far distance, that long row of people, they are walking to the gas chambers, to their deaths, but they don't know that. The longer row of people in the foreground are men, the shorter row are women, and they are walking towards a group of Nazi officers where they will be selected for life or for death. And my mother distinctly remembered one of these selections where Dr. Mengele was presiding. You probably know that Dr. Mengele was one of the most notorious Nazi officers. He was a medical doctor who actually specialized in appalling experiments upon sets of twins, upon pregnant women, upon babies. And my mother remembered hearing him say, "Diese Mal sehr gutes Material," which means this time we have very good material in front of us, not people, units of slave labor. Now, all the rest of my family, except for my one grandfather, my own parents, so my three other grandparents, my two aunts, my cousin Peter, and most of the other members of the extended family, they were all sent to Auschwitz a long time before my own parents were. And when they arrived, then none of those initial procedures took place. They were able to keep their clothes, their luggage, they weren't shaved, they weren't tattooed, and they were sent to what was called a Familienlager. That meant a family camp. All it meant was that one or two of those huts had families together. And there was just one very cynical reason why, and that was so that they could be forced to write postcards home. Next picture, please. And my aunt, the lady wearing the yellow star in that earlier photograph, she wrote this postcard to her cousin who still happened to be in Prague. Next picture, please. This shows you the text of the postcard. Some of you may be able to read it. I will read you the English translation. You can see the date, the 20th of October, 1943. It starts off with the words, "Meine Lieben, my dear ones. I'm here with my husband, my sister, and my nephew. All are well and in good health. My husband received a parcel yesterday from our housekeeper, and I would ask you to confirm this to her. Please also thank Gertie. Could she greet Birte Schmidt for us? I hope you're well and happy. Your parents are very well at the time of our departure. Right soon. Peter looks well. Peter's my 8-year-old cousin. Peter looks well and looks forward to receiving news from you. Greetings and kisses, yours, Dana." I imagine that you will agree with me that basically sounds like, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. And my aunt was desperate to get a message out in code. She got the message out. It was understood. It was acted upon. Next picture, please. In the top left-hand corner, you can see the sender's full name, Sidonie Isidore. She'd married that man in the first photograph. Underneath that is her birthday, the 21st of March, 1904. Underneath that, it says Birkenau. I wonder if any of you happen to have remembered the first name of the lady to whom it was sent. Her name was Olga. The word Olga does not feature in the address. Where the word Olga should be is the word Lechem, which is neither Czech nor German. The word Lechem is Hebrew for bread. And my aunt was telling her cousin that they were starving. Her cousin understood, her cousin sent a parcel, but the contents of it would have been stolen long before it got anywhere near them. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that even before the postcard was sent from Auschwitz to Prague, they were all dead. All of them. Next picture, please. Now, my mother, because she was still strong enough for work, she was sent out of Auschwitz. She was sent to a slave labor camp, to an armaments factory in a place called Freiburg in Germany, near Dresden, where she was made to work on this. And as I'm sure some of you will know, this is the V1, the unmanned flying bomb. And my mother was to remain in Freiburg for 6 months. That's from October of 1944 to the end of March, beginning of April of 1945. And the end of the war in Europe was the 8th of May. And during those 6 months, she was becoming progressively more and more starved and more obviously pregnant, which was very, very dangerous for her. But fortunately, the Germans only realized she was pregnant when it was too late to send her back to Auschwitz to be killed, because Auschwitz had been liberated. We do know of women who were sent back before it was liberated, and Mengele took the most unspeakable revenge on them because he felt they'd got away with it. And during the 6 months that my mother was in Freiburg, that is when the Allied bombing raids of Dresden took place. I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, know about the controversy that surrounded the Dresden raids, but I hope you will appreciate that in this particular context I'm talking to you from my mother's very, very personal perspective. And from her perspective, the raids were just fantastic. What happened when the air raid started was the Germans locked all the prisoners in the factory and they went to the air raid shelters. And the prisoners, even though they knew the next bomb could fall on them and kill a lot of them, nevertheless they were very pleased because they realised it was the Allies, and they hoped and prayed that it wouldn't be too much longer before they were actually rescued. Next picture, please. And this is where my father-in-law comes into the story very, very indirectly. My father-in-law, Kenneth Clark, he came from the Welsh Herefordshire border. He was in the RAF, he was a navigator, he was in Bomber Command, and he was on the Dresden raids. And after the war, when he first met my mother and heard her tell what had happened to her, he was absolutely devastated at the thought that he really could have killed her. Next picture, please. This is quite dark, but it shows the front cover of his logbook. It reads Royal Air Force Navigators, Air Bombers and Air Gunners, Flying Logbook, Flight Lieutenant Clark. Next picture, please, shows a page from his logbook, and the next picture shows a line highlighted from that same page. And it reads, on the 13th of the 2nd, 45, the 13th of February 1945, 1740 hours, 20 to 6 in the evening. Lancaster, that was the airplane. And on the right-hand side, you can see the word Dresden. So he really could have killed her. At the end of March, beginning of April of 1945, this is when the Germans, realising they were losing the war, this is when they began to evacuate the camps. They were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses as to what had been going on inside them. And this is when the notorious death marches happened. My mother wasn't on a death march, but she was put on yet another train. But this time it didn't consist of cattle trucks. This time it consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy. Next picture, please. And would have looked something like this. My mother was on a train like this with almost 2,000 others for 17 days with no food and hardly any water. And after the war, when similar trains were discovered and opened up, they were discovered to just have piles of corpses in them. And during this 17-day nightmare of a journey, the train was stopped, the doors were opened, the dead bodies thrown out, and a farmer walked by, and he saw my mother. And he had such a shock. My mother described herself as looking like a scarcely living, pregnant skeleton. She weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk. But there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised his whip to shoulder height, as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm, and he let her have the glass of milk. She maintained that to save her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. And the train went on. Next picture, please. And it eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself is a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up the very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock. Because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz, not knowing what that was, this time she knew because she had heard about this notorious place very early on in the war. And she maintained that the shock was so great that it probably provoked the onset of her labour. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off it unaided. She had to climb onto a cart because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the hill to the camp, they had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. And she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labour, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always said that she was screaming not only because she was in labour, but because she thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner. And presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came and he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived. and the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April 1945, the Germans had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday was the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again, I wouldn't be here today. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckons she wouldn't have or we wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays is put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. I was wrapped in paper. Or perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time. Now I do appreciate I'm probably well over my time, but the last bit is the best bit to come. Please bear with me. I hope Lord Austin will forgive me if I overrun. So I'm just going to skim through the next few slides. The next picture shows the main form of torture. All prisoners had to work all daylight hours in a stone quarry, and those are people on the left-hand side. And the next picture, please, shows after liberation, when some of the prisoners who were strong enough, they're pulling down the Nazi emblem, the eagle with swastika underneath. Now, after about 3 weeks, when my mother was strong enough to travel, the Americans asked her if she wanted to be repatriated to Prague. She said yes. And so we were put on yet another train, an ordinary train this time. We arrived back in Prague. It was at night and it was dark. And my mother said that was the worst moment of her 3.5 years incarceration in camps. Because up to that moment, she'd never allowed herself to think as to what had probably happened to all the rest of the family. She just never let herself think about it. But you know, arriving at your own station, you wonder if there might be anybody there to meet you, and of course there wasn't. But nevertheless, she still had a vestige of optimism at the back of her mind, and she thought that if any other member of the family had survived, there was a chance that it could be her cousin, the lady who received the postcard. And indeed she had. My mother asked somebody to give us some money to go on the tram. We arrived at my aunt's flat, and my mother was a very practical woman, and the first words she said to my aunt were, "We haven't got any lice." Well, we were riddled with lice, and we had scabies, which I think we had. And the second thing she said was, "Please, could we stay for a few days to recover?" Well, we actually stayed for 3 years. And that was fantastic. It's the happy things that make me emotional. And because my mother had been given closure quite soon after the end of the war, when she was told of the death of my father, so 3 years later, she was able to consider a new life and a new marriage. Next picture, please. And this shows you my stepfather. My stepfather, Karel Bergman, was also Czech and also Jewish. But like my uncle, he escaped in 1939. He got to the UK, he joined the RAF. He was too old to be trained as a pilot, but because he spoke languages, he was made an official interpreter. And after the war, he came back to Prague to pick up the pieces of his family, most of whom had also been killed in Auschwitz. And he met my mother, whom he had known as a family friend before the war, and they decided to get married, and they also decided to leave, because this was now 1948, and that is when the communists took over, and they did not want to live under a communist regime. And so we came to the UK, and although we came legally, I would like to stress, we might have come as refugees, we might have come as asylum seekers, we might have come as migrants. We arrived in this country, my stepfather got a job quite quickly in South Wales, I think the uniform probably helped, and as a result I grew up in Cardiff. Next picture please. I know I've changed, just a bit. I don't have plaits anymore. Well, I do have the plaits, but they're a different colour. As you can see, this is a very happy picture. We're on our way to my first school prize giving, where my mother shed a lot of tears. Well, all the parents and grandparents shed tears at prize giving, but I think she might have cried a bit more because unknown to her, I was about to receive a prize for reading, and I hadn't spoken a word of English the previous year. And then people say to me, well, you know, what did she look like in more recent times? So next picture, please. I'm sure you can all tell where we are. We're on the London Eye. When the London Eye opened, I asked my mother what she would like to do as a birthday treat. She was then 85, and she said, well, everybody's going on this London Eye, I want to go. So we did, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. And next picture, please, shows my mother 10 years later on her 95th birthday, about 95. And my next and last picture, please, shows my 4-generation photograph. I have 2 sons. and they have 4 children between them, and my mother could never get over the fact that she'd survived her wartime experiences, that I survived, and that she ended her life at age 96 with 3 great grandchildren. And that's the story, and I do apologise for overrunning time.
Eva, I'm sure you can see from that heartfelt standing ovation from the people of Dudley, especially so many young people here today, just what your story and your message have meant to people here. I didn't write any kind of speech as a vote of thanks because I've come to 3 of these now as Bishop of Dudley. The last one's on Zoom, this is the first one in person. And every time they're the kind of stories that any words of thanks cannot possibly do justice to. They're mind-blowing in every sense and heart-touching. And the privilege of meeting someone who's lived through such extraordinary circumstances and survived and speaks of love and speaks of life. How amazing is that? Cassidy, you said at the beginning, ordinary people were part of the theme this year. And with those extraordinary stories, I think it's so important to remember they are ordinary people like you and me, living through unbelievable horror. But in the midst of that, you've got those ordinary people going out to the cinema, even when the Nazis are in power, meeting her husband, somehow making love, making a baby, in the midst of situations where that is almost unimaginable. Choosing life, choosing love, rebelling in that most wonderful human way. Or on that horrible journey on the coal truck, the person who offered her that glass of milk. He could have shouted abuse. He could have turned the other way. He could have felt much too frightened of the punishment he might receive for showing kindness. But instead he chose love. He chose life. He gave life to Anchor and to Eva. So never think what you do is unimportant. Never think your choices are not important. When you hear people talking of illegal migrants, swarms of people trying to invade our country today, just think of this story and a faraway place where other people, othered other people, tried to pretend they weren't ordinary people like you and like me. Remember the danger that that brought to that society. Germany is not a bad place. It was full of beautiful, ordinary people, as it is today. But societies can go wrong. Civilization can be destroyed. It depends on people like you and like me, and especially our young people here today, to stand up for what is right, what is good, and remember that other people, however different they may seem, are ordinary people, just like you, longing for life, longing for love. So Eva, you've helped us see some of that today, and let's just give her another heart round. In a moment, I'm going to invite some people to join Eva and myself here, just to say who they are, but they don't need to stand up yet. That is the Mayor of Dudley, and then representatives of other faiths, Rabbi Margaret Jacobi, and other faith communities here in Dudley. I think those people know who they are and will come forward. We're going to light a candle and have a minute's silence. And I'll invite you to stand, if you're able to, for that. Just before I do that, Lord Austin has asked me to remember Ziggy Schipper, BEM, who came to Dudley to speak at the first of these events in 2006 and again in 2019. Ziggy was a great man, and I'm sorry to tell you that he died on Wednesday this week. Ziggy was born in Poland in 1930, imprisoned in a ghetto during the war, transported from there to Auschwitz-Birkenau and then to Stutthof concentration camp. Liberated in 1945, just as Eva was being born, he spent then 3 months in hospital, eventually coming to Britain in 1947, age 17. Wonder if there's any 17-year-olds here today. What a life he'd lived by that stage. Here, though, he chose life, he chose love, he married, had a family like Eva, spent a lot of his time teaching communities like ours about the Holocaust and just where prejudice and racism can lead. The message he always wanted people to hear was, do not hate. So if those members of faith communities would like to just come forward to join me here as we light our candle. The Mayor of Dudley, Rabbi Margaret. Thank you. And then I'd ask all of you please to stand as we remember the 6 million Jewish people and all the others murdered in the Holocaust and in subsequent genocides. We remember Eva's family and Ziggy and his family. That's all I've got to say. Does anyone have a life? No one smokes anymore. Just needed to go near to Eva's notes. We hold a minute's silence as we remember the 6 million Jewish people, all others murdered in the Holocaust, especially Eva's dear family. As it said in the Jewish tradition, may their memories be a blessing. May we choose life and choose life. Amen. And if we leave Rabbi Margaret here, if the rest of us follow me off the stage. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Eva again for telling her story to us so movingly. As we've heard, there are fewer survivors now, and the death this week of Ziggy Shipper, which I'm so sad to hear about, makes that even more evident and more poignant. And so I thought I'd read a short passage addressed to the last survivor. Wherever you may be, whenever that may be, I shall be there with you, the last survivor. Because you will be the last survivor, I shall be there, I promise you. I promise you to be the memory of your memory. I promise that what you have endured will not be erased from the human conscience. I promise you this ultimate justice, that neither your name nor your suffering shall be permitted to vanish from world history. You were one man, one woman, but it is as if you had been one suffering humanity. And because you will be the last, it will be my duty to take over your martyrdom as one takes over in a relay, not in order to relive it, but to relate it for all time, to bear witness before history, in order that criminals shall no longer be absolved, to teach children that having become adults, they may build a society conscious of its past and resolutely turn towards a future of justice, love and peace. And so we remember of 6 million Jews and those millions of other people who died when madness ruled. We remember those who we know and those whose very names are lost. We mourn that all that died with them, their goodness and their wisdom, which could have done so much to ennoble and enrich humanity. We mourn for the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. And we salute those who had the courage to stand outside the mob, to save us and to suffer with us. They too are God's witnesses and a source of hope when we are tempted to despair. And so we pray, Ba'al harachamim, hasdireim b'seita kanafecha la'olamim, B'tzro hachayim et nishmotam, Adonai hu nachalatam, v'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavam, v'ramah. Amen. Merciful God, shelter them forever under your wings, and let their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they find their destiny in your nearness, and may they rest in peace. Amen.
I think we can all sit, you know, but well, Madam Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, look, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I think it's fantastic, you know, that we're able to do this in person again after the last 3 years. And I didn't know how many people would come because we've had this gap, so it's fantastic to see the hall full. And it's brilliant to see so many young people, the students and the school people as well. And as I say, we've got the Mayor here, the Leader of the Council, the Chief Executive, several of the borough's MPs, Pam McFadden, Mark O'Longley, Mike Wood and Suzanne Webber here as well, and lots of councillors, lots of other people from town, so I want to thank you all for coming. There's a few people I want to thank personally. I thought Molly and Cassidy were just fantastic. Thank you so much for being part of this. I thought it was brilliant. I want to thank the small team of volunteers who organised this now. I realised how hard my office used to work when I was the MP. Now that I have to get involved in the organisation myself, it's so some people work really hard on this. Amanda, Kieran, Martin, Sophia, everybody from the Holocaust Educational Trust. In particular, Amanda Appleby spends hours on this, hours every year. So I want to thank Amanda in particular. And Amanda, we've got some flowers for you if you would like to come down. Kieran's going to give you those. So let's give Amanda a big round of applause. I want to thank Rabbi Margaret, who has been coming to speak at these events for well over a decade now. And we're so grateful to you for being with us and for the contribution you made to this. Now, Margaret's retiring next week, I think, is that right? And actually going to work at a synagogue, I think, in Australia, immediately. So this is the sort of last thing Margaret's doing, and it's taken time out from packing everything up to come and be with us today. And I know it's a real sort of imposition. You know, it's been in amidst all the arrangements you've got to make. So we've got some flowers for Margaret as well, which I think, Cassidy, you're going to give to Margaret. And let's give Margaret a big round of applause. And most of all, Eva. Ladies and gentlemen, Eva's travelled from Cambridge to be with us today. It's a long journey, long day for her. And I know it's not easy, the arrangements you have to make now to do these journeys and to spend a day away from home. So, but look, I promise you this, none of the people, this audience spellbound, hanging on every word, and none of the people, particularly the young people, are ever going to forget listening to you today. And I think it's amazing, extraordinary, that you spend so much of your time coming to communities like ours, helping us build a stronger and more united community and a stronger society. Not just here in Dudley, but all the places. Eva told me that she's speaking every day for 3 weeks in January in the run-up to and after Holocaust Memorial Day. So it's not just Dudley that you're doing this, but all over the country as well. Now, I was worried about sending you back on the train with a big bunch of flowers, but you're not going to go away empty-handed, and Molly's got a present we'd like to give to you if we can. And really, Eva, what I want to say is this, that, the Nazis didn't win. That photo at the end of you and your mum and your sons, and of you and your mum and your sons and your grandchildren, your mum's great-grandchildren, I think that shows that you and the Nazis didn't win, you and your mum, you won, because you're here today making a big contribution to our community, and we're so grateful for that. And the thing we learned, ladies and gentlemen, when we listen to Eva and other survivors speak about how their families were torn apart, as Kieran said, that the Holocaust didn't start in the concentration camps, but it started with communities being divided by prejudice and by hatred. And so when people try to divide our diverse, harmonious, multi-faith community on the basis of what people look like, where they were born, how they worship, how they came to our country, let's remember that it's because of who we are as a people and what we are as a country that people from towns like ours, relatives, fathers, grandfathers of some of the people in the room I know, stood up to the Nazis and fought for freedom and democracy and for tolerance and fairness. And people in our town provided a refuge and a home to refugees as well. And I want to tell you today about a 14-year-old German refugee called Kurt Flossman, who arrived at Dudley Grammar School, now St James's Academy, in 1939 at the age of 14. And his Jewish father had died in 1937. He made his way across Europe on his own. He ended up in Dudley. His classmates, the same age as pupils here today, clubbed together to fund his living expenses. Local firms paid for his clothes. George Kreisel became one of the world's leading mathematicians. He escaped from Austria. He came to school here in Dudley. Teachers at the grammar school realised they'd got a mathematical genius on their hands. And he went on to become one of the world's leading mathematicians, a professor at Stanford in California. And lots of children came to Dudley then because the mayor at the time, head teachers at local schools and other people in the town, they set up a refugee committee. Many of the refugees came to study at this college as well. I don't know if there's anybody here from the zoo today, but it was fascinating for me to learn that the zoo was opened in 1937, and the chief scientist at the zoo at the time was a refugee called Hans Honigmann, who had fled the Nazis, and he'd been a scientific advisor at Breslau Zoo before becoming a refugee and coming to the UK. Refugee girls were taught at the high school. They lived with families in Dudley, in Kings Linford, and in Gornal. Rosa Vansky, this is amazing, Rosa Vansky, born in Germany in 1922. In 1938, her Jewish father was in prison in Dachau, and she managed to escape on the Kindertransport and came here to Dudley as a refugee. And this is the amazing thing. She was only able to escape because a local family, the Cohens, lived at 55 Wellington Road. The house is still there. They were not related to her. They'd never met her, but they heard about her from the refugee committee, and they put up £50, that was required at the time, a £50 guarantee, in order to sponsor a refugee to come to the country. A lot of money in those days, the equivalent of about £3,000 today. And this family there never met her, never knew her family, put the money up so that she could escape. This is incredible. She became one of the world's most famous hairdressers. She was up there with Vidal Sassoon in the 60s and the 70s. It's no exaggeration to say that she invented modern hairdressing. Lots of the techniques in modern hairdressing were invented by her. So, ladies, all of you ladies here today, looking so glamorous with your blow waves and all that, you've got a refugee saved by people in Dudley to thank for it. Isn't that amazing? My own dad, Fred Austin, arrived as a refugee in 1939. The rest of his family murdered in Treblinka. And like Eva, he was honoured by the Queen, made a big contribution, as many of you will know, to community life here in Dudley. And I think that the reason I'm telling you these stories is for two reasons. First, I want people to know that Dudley has always worked to help those in need and to build a tolerant community. And second, the refugees have made a huge contribution to our community, to life here in Dudley, and to our country as a whole. And since the war, we've welcomed refugees from Vietnam, Uganda, Kenya, Kashmir, Kosovo, Iran, Iraq, and many other countries. More recently, Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And if people want to make an issue out of any of this, out of helping these people, tell them this. This is who we are in Dudley, and this is what we do. It's who we are, and it is what we do. And immediately after this, I want to invite you all of those who are able to, have got the time, to come across the Coronation Gardens, where Eva, the Mayor, the Lord Lieutenant, the Leader of the Council, will be planting a tree with Michael Newman, who is the Chief Executive of the Association of Jewish Refugees, and is with us here today. and some local students who've arrived in Dudley as refugees themselves. And we're so grateful to Patrick and to Kevin, the leader of the council and the chief exec, for supporting this project so strongly and for enabling this to happen. And to Anthea Jones from the council, who's worked so hard on this. Now, AJR provide brilliant social and welfare services to Holocaust survivors and refugees. About 70,000 of whom 10,000 children arrived in Britain in the 1930s. It was founded in 1941 by refugees themselves and continues today to care for refugees and their descendants, including here in the West Midlands. And they've had a project to plant 80 trees for 80 years of their work. And the one we're planting today in Dudley is the final one, which is a great honour for us. And these trees mark the contribution of refugees to Britain and mark places across the country, like ours, which have connections to refugees and to the Holocaust. So we're really grateful, Michael, to you and your colleagues for making this happen. But this tree, ladies and gentlemen, isn't just about what happened in Dudley 70 or 80 years ago. We're going to start over the next year. We're going to have a project, college, local schools in the Dudley Academies Trust, the council, CFED, others, to produce a project, an exhibition about refugees that have been welcomed to Dudley and the contribution that they've made to the town. And hopefully that exhibition will be on display here when we meet in 12 months' time for next year's commemoration. But just for today, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to invite anybody who would like to and who's able to join us in Coronation Gardens. So for the unveiling, for the planting of this tree. So thank you very much indeed for coming here today. It's been a fantastic day.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here today to represent the Association of Jewish Refugees on this poignant and special occasion. And I want to thank everyone here in Dudley who has made this event possible. For those of you who are not familiar with the AJR, we deliver critical social and welfare services and volunteer assistance to Holocaust refugees like Fred and survivors like Eva. Work that has taken on an added urgency with the changing demography of our organisation. As was just mentioned, we were established in 1941 in response to the reversal of the government's disastrous policy of internment, during which some 25,000 Jewish refugees who fled Nazi oppression were rounded up and sent to places like the Isle of Man. Regrettably, Churchill's call to collar the lot meant that pro-Nazi Germans were also interned together with Jewish refugees. The experience of the refugees solidified in their mind the need for their own organisation, representing their interests and reflecting their culture and heritage. And despite the passage of time, we're still finding new first-generation Holocaust survivors and refugees, and we stand ready to help that unique community with our transformative support. So, although tangential to today's event, if you happen to know of anyone who might need that assistance, please do let us know. Increasingly, our members represent the next generations, and we have introduced special programmes and activities for the second, third and now the fourth generations. Earlier this month we were delighted to launch the Hyphen, a group dedicated for the interests of the third generation, like myself. Next week we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, when communities all around the world stop to remember the atrocities that happened in Europe during the Second World War and rededicate ourselves to taking action to prevent similar crimes recurring. But today is also the anniversary of another key date in the history of the Holocaust. Today we remember the Wannsee Conference, when 15 high-ranking Nazis, educated, intellectual men, led by Heydrich and Himmler, gathered at a villa on the outskirts of Berlin to plan and carry out the final solution, the genocide of European Jewry, and in so doing seal the fate of 6 million Jews and many hundreds of thousands of other innocent people. So we are both humbled and proud that Dudley has chosen to mark the occasion by honouring its strong personal connections with the Jewish refugees and others fleeing oppression from subsequent atrocities. And in so doing, Dudley becomes part of our 80 Trees for 80 Years project, and one of the locations where we've planted a tree. From Castle Douglas up in Scotland to Mousehole on the coast of Cornwall, from the port of Harwich in Essex to Abergavenny in Wales, we are marking places that were hugely important to the Jewish refugees 80 years ago. And as we heard earlier from Ian, the people of Dudley opened their hearts and doors to those fleeing oppression, and in so doing demonstrated that ordinary people, the theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day, acted to save lives and offer safe harbour. Each tree celebrates the life and the remarkable impact that has been made by the Jewish refugees to every walk of every part of Jewish life. The literary critic George Steiner once said, "When you come to a house as a guest, you must try and leave the house a little nicer than when you found it." Let us not forget that many of the refugees who arrived managed to escape from Europe, arriving here with little more than the clothes they were wearing. And despite, or perhaps because of, the massive traumas they had experienced, many were able to build a new life for themselves. And while one wag described a refugee as someone who had lost everything except his accent, many embraced opportunities in their new homeland, and in so doing made a lasting impression on British culture and society, in industry, in business, in commerce, media and the arts. From the design of the iconic London bus stop design to Andrew Sachs's Manuel in 40 Towers and everything in between. Oak trees are Britain's national trees, and they support more other forms of natural life, wildlife, than any other tree. But like lots of things in our environment, they're coming under threat, and they need our protection. So this tree is not just a way of remembering the Jewish refugees, it also helps to give them something back to the country which became their home. Similarly, we are thrilled that the planting of this tree will launch a project over the next few months by the council, the local schools, the college and the Centre for Equality and Diversity to celebrate the contribution of refugees from many different countries and backgrounds. We're delighted that this tree being planted here in this lovely park, where we know it will be cared for and will thrive, and we thank you all again for your support for this wonderful project. Thank you very much. And it now gives me great pleasure to invite Eva, the Lord Lieutenant and the Mayor to plant the tree.